He would slide the ice pick right up on the inside of the eye.
I present to you the lobotomy.
Get it inside there and start swishing it around. He was going rogue, going out on his own and doing this. My name is Sam Kean, and I'm the author of The Ice Pick Surgeon: Murder, Fraud, Sabotage, Piracy, and Other Dastardly Deeds Perpetrated in the Name of Science.
Sam Kean tells the troubling story of Dr. Walter Freeman, who performed over 2,000 lobotomies in his controversial career.
Walter Freeman was a doctor, a neurologist, a brain doctor, who was coming up in the 1920s, 1930s. And at the time, there was a big problem in most cities in that they had insane asylums where they kept people who had brain disturbances, who'd gone crazy, and doctors essentially had zero ways to treat these people.
In nearly all state mental hospitals, little more than custodial care was provided. Few who were committed could hope to return to society.
There were no drugs available, no effective therapies, nothing they could do with them. They kept them in small locked rooms, often in straitjackets. And he was very moved by this, very affected by this. And he wanted badly to help them, to do something for them. Unfortunately, his idea on how to treat them was to jump both feet first into a treatment we now call the lobotomy. So the basic idea of a lobotomy is that you have different parts of your brain and you want to separate those two parts. So you have the frontal lobes, which control things like higher reasoning, planning, things like that. Then a little deeper inside your brain, you have structures called the limbic system. Those are involved in processing emotions, things like that. And the theory at the time, we now know it was incorrect, was that the emotional parts of the brain were getting revved up, running out of control, and they were overwhelming the frontal parts of the brain. So the idea essentially was to sever the connections between the frontal lobes and the limbic system inside the brain.
The lobotomy was developed by a Portuguese doctor named Igás Moniz, but Freeman became the procedure's most enthusiastic proponent.
During his career, he actually used two different techniques. And the first technique was a full-on brain surgery. So they had an actual neurosurgeon there, anesthesiologist, everyone, full sterile setup, the whole thing. They would go in, they would cut a hole on both sides of the brain, and they would put basically a long metal shim in there. They would start to swish it around in order to sever these connections between different parts of the brain. Unfortunately, Walter Freeman was a very ambitious person, and he decided to go far beyond this. And essentially, he looked at all of the insane asylums around the country, and he said, we have hundreds of thousands of people. If we have to do a full-on surgery every single time, that will take forever. There's no way we're going to clear the insane asylums out like I want to do. So he developed essentially a mass production way of doing this. It was sort of a Jiffy Lube lobotomy in that he could do them very quickly. And the tool he used to do this was literally an ice pick that he opened his kitchen drawer one day, saw the ice pick and thought, I can do neurosurgery with this. This is the key to my problem. He would do up to 25 lobotomies in a single day. Kind of a show off. He liked reporters being around, taking pictures, things like that. He eventually developed a way to do two at once, one with each hand at the same time.
Freeman even took his lobotomy show on the road.
Freeman loved to take long summer road trips, and eventually he decided to combine those with his lobotomy work by driving around the country, usually to small rural places, hopping from asylum to asylum. He would get there and they would have maybe 24 patients lined up for him to do lobotomies on every single one of them.
He performed the procedure even when it wasn't necessary.
He would use these as preventative measures. So if he saw someone who might in the future develop a mental disorder or need to be institutionalized, something like that, he would say, hey, let's nip this in the bud. Let's prevent them from even getting into an asylum and perform it preemptively. And that to me is the really dangerous thing that he did. Because, yeah, some people went to institutions, but sometimes they got back out of institutions. In fact, most people, they had a bad spell, they were down for a while, they needed some help, but they would bounce back eventually. So him going in there and destroying healthy brain matter was really an irresponsible thing to do in the service of his ambition, essentially. He started to basically drag the age level down and started doing it on teenagers and even young children, people whose brains had not fully developed yet. And that's where he really strayed from someone who was merely pushing the boundaries to someone who was doing sort of sinful science.
Not surprisingly, the procedure had its risks.
In some cases, he did actually do serious brain damage, and the person ended up sort of like the Hollywood stereotype, where they were drooling, could not take care of themselves, completely oblivious to everything around them. The much more common outcome was, as he said, they lost their sparkle. So they essentially lost their personality. So they might just be sitting in a room all day, staring at the wall. They would have no ambition to do anything more. They would have no ambition. They had no wants, no real desires.
Freeman's best-known lobotomy patient may have been Rosemary Kennedy, the younger sister of President John F. Kennedy.
She grew up a little slow, a little different. She was very high-spirited. She was fairly normal, but just a little slower. Unfortunately, to the Kennedy family, who had big political ambitions, they thought of her essentially as an embarrassment. They didn't want her to be seen in public with them. They wanted to kind of keep her in the shadows. Made her father furious. He wanted to essentially control her, calm her down. And so he started talking with Walter Freeman, who was working in Washington, D.C., where Joseph Kennedy, the father, had a lot of political connections. And eventually went to Freeman and had them do this procedure on Rosemary. The results were fairly disastrous for her. Afterwards, she couldn't speak very well, couldn't use utensils, struggled to go to the bathroom, things like that. She eventually did recover to some degree where she could do basic everyday things. But after that, she just wasn't herself anymore. She lost her sparkle, she lost her personality, and she had to be institutionalized for the rest of her life.
Freeman's cavalier approach resulted in patient deaths as well.
There were several cases where people died, either because he nicked an artery in the brain, or in one case, he had the ice pick in the person's brain and stopped to take a picture, and it was at a bad angle and actually slid down to their midbrain, so the back of their brain that controls basic processes like breathing, wake, sleep cycles, things like that, and ended up killing the person on the table.
Yet Freeman never faced consequences equal to his misdeeds.
He never faced any legal repercussions, but there were eventually repercussions where he would lose his ability to perform operations essentially at different hospitals. They would rescind that right. And eventually he did become a pariah in the medical community.
Kean says Freeman's sins may be attributed in part to his lack of scientific rigor.
He really didn't do scientific studies, because to do a scientific study, he should have set up a lobotomy group and a control group where you treat the lobotomy patients, then you follow the control patients, compare their outcomes over time. He never did that. He just jumped in, did everyone with a lobotomy, and then came back later and said, hey, everyone's doing great, so you should all completely trust me on this. And that's just not how science works. If you are going to try a new experimental medical procedure, you do have to work within the boundaries of science. Science can be slow sometimes, that can be frustrating, but there's a reason for these rules. These rules help us establish when things are working, when they're not working, and when the risk outweighs the potential benefits.
Freeman continued to perform lobotomies even after new drug treatments were introduced to help patients.
To his big discredit, Even after the drugs came out, he tried to discredit them. He tried to smear them, essentially, because he wanted the lobotomy, again, to be the first treatment for anyone with mental illness.
Walter Freeman performed his last lobotomy in 1967. The patient died. Freeman himself died in 1972.
He was just so convinced that his way was correct and it was the best way to do things. And any other treatment was not going to be as good. And that was it. And he would just not listen to any sort of common sense, any statistics, anything like that. He was convinced lobotomies were the only humane way to treat people.
This is Inside Edition Digital.